Welcome to Spiritual Journals. Today, I want to take you on a journey into the life of one of the most extraordinary figures in biblical history, Elijah. He wasn't just a prophet, Elijah was a man chosen by God to stand boldly in one of Israel's most spiritually dark times. His story is not simply about miracles and power but a profound narrative of faith, struggle, and an unshakable connection with God. It's a story that speaks to us today as clearly as it did thousands of years ago. So, let's uncover the hidden truth about Elijah that every Christian needs to know. Elijah's life was marked by dramatic moments of triumph and adversity. He called down fire from heaven, challenged the prophets of Baal, prayed for rain after years of drought, and witnessed God's miraculous provision time and time again. But his journey wasn't always easy. After one of his greatest victories on Mount Carmel, Elijah found himself in despair, fleeing for his life when Queen Jezebel sought to kill him. In that moment, this mighty man of faith felt utterly defeated. Yet, here lies the hidden truth: even in his fear and weakness, God never abandoned Elijah. In the stillness of a cave, God spoke, not through the wind, fire, or earthquake, but in a gentle whisper. This moment reveals a profound lesson: God meets us in our struggles, not with condemnation but with compassion and reassurance. Elijah's story reminds us that faith is not the absence of fear but trusting God despite it. It's a reminder that in life's chaos, God often speaks to us in the quiet moments. Elijah's journey shows us the power of a life fully surrendered to God and offers hope for every believer who seeks His voice. Who was Elijah? The story that inspires us all. Elijah wasn't born into fame or privilege. He wasn't a king, a warrior, or a man of great wealth. He emerged from complete obscurity, a man whose humble beginnings gave no hint of the extraordinary role he would play in the history of God's people. Yet Elijah became one of the most powerful and influential prophets, chosen by God to deliver his message during one of the darkest spiritual times in Israel's history. The world Elijah stepped into was a world consumed by idolatry. The people of Israel, once set apart as God's chosen nation, had turned their backs on him. Under the influence of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, Baal worship became widespread, filling the land with corruption, false gods, and evil practices. It seemed as though God's people had forgotten the one who had delivered them, provided for them, and called them his own. And yet, amid this spiritual darkness, Elijah stood firm. He didn't come with armies or political power. He came with one thing: an unshakable faith in the one true God. When everyone else cowered in fear or followed the crowd, Elijah boldly declared the truth. He stood alone against 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, proving once and for all that God was the only one worthy of worship. He prayed for fire from heaven, and God answered in spectacular fashion, consuming the sacrifice, the altar, and even the water around it. But Elijah's story isn't just about miracles. It's about the profound truth that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Elijah wasn't a perfect man. He experienced fear, doubt, and discouragement, just like us. After his victory on Mount Carmel, when Queen Jezebel threatened his life, Elijah fled into the wilderness, feeling utterly defeated. He sat under a tree and asked God to take his life. He believed he had failed, that he was the only one left who still worshipped God. And here is where the story becomes so relatable, so inspiring. Elijah wasn't a superhero. He was a human being who struggled with the same emotions and challenges we all face. Yet, God didn't give up on him. In his moment of despair, God met Elijah with compassion, not judgment. He sent an angel to provide food and water, restoring Elijah's strength. Then he spoke to him, not in a dramatic display of fire, wind, or earthquakes, but in a gentle whisper. This is the incredible truth we see in Elijah's life: God can use anyone who is willing to trust Him, even in the face of impossible odds. It doesn't matter where you come from, how ordinary or unworthy you may feel, or how many mistakes you've made. If you are willing to step out in faith, God can do extraordinary things through you. Elijah's courage teaches us that standing for truth may not always be easy, but it is always worth it. He shows us that one person, fully committed to God, can make a difference, even in a world that seems lost in darkness. But perhaps the most comforting lesson from Elijah's life is that even when we falter, when our faith wavers and we feel like giving up, God doesn't abandon us. He meets us where we are, restores our strength, and gently reminds us of His presence. So, what does Elijah's story mean for you? It's a challenge to stand boldly for God, even when it feels like you're the only one. It's a reminder that God's power is greater than any opposition you may face. And it's an encouragement to trust Him, even when the odds seem impossible. Elijah wasn't extraordinary because of who he was. He was extraordinary because of who God is. And that same God is ready to work through you today, just as He did through Elijah. Will you trust Him? The hidden truth, faith beyond fear. Elijah's story is filled with awe-inspiring miracles. He called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, an event that stands as one of the most dramatic displays of God's power in the Bible. He prayed earnestly, and after years of drought, the rains came. He even raised a widow's son from the dead, proving that God's hand was on him. These are the moments that often define Elijah's legacy, and rightly so. They are incredible demonstrations of what happens when a person walks in obedience and faith. But if we focus only on these miraculous moments, we miss the hidden truth of Elijah's story. That truth lies not just in the supernatural but in his humanity. You see, Elijah wasn't just a fearless prophet. He was a man, like us, who faced fear, discouragement, and doubt despite everything he had seen God do. After his stunning victory on Mount Carmel, where he confronted the 450 prophets of Baal and proved that God alone is real, Elijah should have been at the peak of his confidence. Imagine standing on that mountain, watching fire fall from heaven and consume the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water surrounding the altar. Imagine hearing the people cry out, "The Lord, He is God." It was a moment of triumph, a vindication for Elijah's faith. And yet, almost immediately after this victory, Elijah fell into fear and despair. When Queen Jezebel heard what had happened, she sent him a death threat, vowing to kill him. Instead of standing firm, the same Elijah who had just witnessed God's unmatched power ran for his life. He fled into the wilderness, overwhelmed and broken. He sat down under a tree and prayed that he might die, saying, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors." Can you imagine that? A man who had just seen fire fall from heaven, a man who had been fed by ravens and seen miracles firsthand, now doubting God's ability to protect him from Jezebel. It's almost shocking. But it's also profoundly relatable. This moment reveals a hidden truth: even the strongest believers face fear and discouragement. No matter how faithful or courageous we may be, life has a way of overwhelming us. We can experience incredible victories and still find ourselves in moments of deep despair. Elijah's humanity shows us that even those who are closest to God are not immune to the struggles of doubt, fear, and exhaustion. But here's the most powerful part of the story: God never abandoned Elijah in his fear. In fact, God met him in his lowest moment with compassion and care. While Elijah hid in the wilderness, God sent an angel to provide food and water for him, not once, but twice. God didn't rebuke him for his fear or criticize him for running away. Instead, He gently restored Elijah's strength and invited him into His presence. When Elijah reached Mount Horeb, God revealed Himself in a way that was completely unexpected. Elijah experienced a mighty wind, an earthquake, and fire, but God wasn't in any of these dramatic events. Instead, God spoke to Elijah in a gentle whisper. This moment is one of the most profound in all of Scripture. It shows us that God doesn't always come to us in dramatic, attention-grabbing ways. Often, He meets us in the quiet, still moments, when we are most vulnerable and willing to listen. What does this mean for us? It means that faith isn't about being fearless all the time. Faith is about trusting God even when we feel afraid, even when we don't understand, and even when we feel like giving up. It's about knowing that God is with us, even in the wilderness. Elijah's story teaches us that it's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to have moments of doubt. What matters is how we respond in those moments. Do we turn to God, as Elijah did, and allow Him to restore us? Or do we try to carry the burden on our own? This hidden truth about Elijah should bring us incredible hope. If a prophet as mighty as Elijah could experience fear and discouragement, it means we're not alone in our struggles. And if God could meet Elijah in his weakness and restore him, it means He will do the same for us. So, when you find yourself in the wilderness, tired, afraid, and ready to give up, remember Elijah. Remember that God isn't far away. He's right there with you, ready to speak to you, not in the chaos, but in the gentle whisper. And remember this, your fear doesn't disqualify your faith. God can still use you, even in your weakness. Elijah's journey shows us that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about holding on to God, even when everything else feels like it's falling apart. And in those moments, just like with Elijah, God's whisper will remind you that you are not alone, and that His power is greater than any fear you face. God's gentle whisper, finding strength in stillness. When Elijah hid in a cave, broken and afraid, he wasn't the bold prophet we often picture. He was a man overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. He had just experienced one of the greatest victories in his ministry, calling down fire from heaven to prove God's power. Yet now, faced with Queen Jezebel's threat, Elijah felt utterly defeated. In his despair, he fled into the wilderness and isolated himself in a cave, unsure of what to do next. This moment in Elijah's life is profoundly relatable. We've all been there, tired, discouraged, and wondering if we have the strength to keep going. But what makes this story so powerful is how God responds to Elijah. While Elijah was hiding in the cave, God didn't scold him. He didn't tell Elijah he was weak for feeling afraid. He didn't question why Elijah doubted after witnessing such miracles. Instead, God did something extraordinary. He revealed Himself in a way Elijah never expected. The Bible tells us that Elijah experienced a mighty wind, an earthquake, and a fire. These are dramatic, awe-inspiring displays of power that might seem fitting for a God who created the universe. But God wasn't in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, after these displays of force, there came a gentle whisper, and that's where God was. This is the hidden truth that Elijah's story reveals. God meets us in our weakness, not with condemnation, but with compassion. He speaks to us not in the chaos, but in the stillness. How often do we look for God in the dramatic moments of life? We expect Him to show up with a miraculous sign or an overwhelming display of power. And while God is capable of such things, Elijah's story reminds us that His voice is often found in the quiet moments, the moments when we are still enough to listen. Elijah's encounter with God in the gentle whisper teaches us several powerful lessons about how God speaks and how we can find His presence in our own lives. God meets us where we are. Elijah wasn't in a temple or leading a great crowd when God spoke to him. He was in a cave, hiding, broken, and afraid. And yet, God didn't wait for Elijah to get it together before speaking to him. He met Elijah in his darkest moment and brought comfort and clarity. This is a reminder that no matter where we are, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, God is willing to meet us there. God doesn't condemn us for our weaknesses. When Elijah expressed his despair and felt like giving up, God didn't respond with anger or frustration. He didn't tell Elijah to just have more faith or dismiss his feelings. Instead, God gently reminded Elijah of His presence and provided what Elijah needed to move forward. In the same way, God is patient and compassionate with us when we struggle. God's voice is found in stillness. In today's world, we're surrounded by noise, distractions from technology, responsibilities, and the chaos of life. It's easy to feel like God is distant when we're constantly surrounded by this noise. But Elijah's story reminds us that God often speaks in the quiet moments. When we slow down, take time to reflect, and open our hearts to Him, we create space to hear His gentle whisper. God's whisper brings peace, guidance, and strength. When Elijah heard God's whisper, it didn't just reassure him, it gave him the strength to carry on. God reminded Elijah of his purpose, gave him specific instructions for the next steps, and reassured him that he was not alone. God does the same for us. When we take time to listen to his voice, we find the peace and clarity we need to move forward, no matter how overwhelmed we may feel. This moment in Elijah's life is a beautiful reminder of God's character. He is not a distant, unfeeling deity who demands perfection from us. He is a loving Father who meets us in our weakness, speaks to us with compassion, and gives us the strength to carry on. So, what can we learn from God's gentle whisper? It's this: we don't need to wait for a dramatic sign or a life-changing miracle to know God is with us. His voice is already there, waiting for us to listen. In the stillness of prayer, the quiet of reflection, and the moments we set aside to seek Him, His whisper brings the peace and strength we need to face life's challenges. The question is, are we taking the time to listen? Are we creating space in our busy lives to hear God's voice? If you're feeling overwhelmed, discouraged, or distant from God, remember Elijah's story. Step away from the noise, find a quiet place, and let God meet you in the stillness. His gentle whisper is always there, ready to bring you the peace, guidance, and reassurance your heart longs for. What can we learn from Elijah's story? Elijah's story is more than just an inspiring tale from the Bible, it's a powerful reminder of how God works in the lives of ordinary people. His journey teaches us profound lessons that can transform how we approach our faith, our fears, and our relationship with God. Let's explore these truths in a deeper, more personal way. God uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. One of the most encouraging aspects of Elijah's story is that he wasn't born into privilege or greatness. He didn't come from a royal family, wasn't a military leader, and didn't have any remarkable qualifications. He was an ordinary man from Tishbe, an insignificant town. And yet, God chose him to be his prophet during one of the most spiritually dark periods in Israel's history. This truth is a beacon of hope for all of us. You don't need to be extraordinary by the world's standards for God to use you. You don't need to have all the answers, a spotless past, or an unshakable confidence. What you need is a willing heart. Elijah's life reminds us that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. No matter who you are or where you come from, God can work through you to accomplish great things. He takes our willingness, our yes, and turns it into something extraordinary. If God can use Elijah, an ordinary man from an ordinary place, He can use you, too. Faith isn't the absence of fear. One of the most relatable moments in Elijah's story is when he fled from Queen Jezebel in fear for his life. Here was a man who had just witnessed fire fall from heaven in one of the most dramatic displays of God's power, and yet he found himself gripped by fear and doubt. He ran into the wilderness, feeling overwhelmed, defeated, and alone. This moment teaches us a vital truth: faith isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to trust God despite it. Even the strongest believers have moments of weakness, and that's okay. Elijah's fear didn't disqualify him from God's plan. In fact, it was in his weakness that God met him with compassion, reassurance, and restoration. In the same way, our fears and doubts don't disqualify us. We don't have to have perfect faith to follow God. What matters is that, even in our fear, we keep turning to Him. Trusting God doesn't mean we won't feel afraid, it means we choose to believe that God is greater than our fears and that He is still in control, even in the darkest moments. So, the next time fear tries to overwhelm you, remember Elijah. Let his story remind you that God is patient with our doubts and faithful to walk with us through them. God speaks in the silence. One of the most profound moments in Elijah's story is when he encountered God on Mount Horeb. Elijah was expecting to find God in the dramatic and powerful, a mighty wind, an earthquake, or fire. But God wasn't in those things. Instead, He revealed Himself in a gentle whisper. This moment is a powerful lesson for us today. We often look for God in big, dramatic ways, but He often speaks to us in the stillness. In our noisy, fast-paced lives, it's easy to feel like God is distant. But maybe the problem isn't that God isn't speaking, it's that we aren't listening. How often do we allow the busyness of life to drown out His voice? How often do we let distractions pull us away from the quiet moments where we could meet Him? Elijah's story reminds us that sometimes, we need to step away from the chaos, find a quiet place, and simply be still. It's in those moments of stillness that we're most likely to hear God's gentle whisper. Taking time to be still and listen isn't always easy, but it's worth it. When we quiet our hearts and open ourselves to God's presence, we create space for Him to speak peace, guidance, and reassurance into our lives. Elijah's story is a powerful call to action for every believer. It challenges us to trust God, even when we feel unworthy, afraid, or overwhelmed. It reminds us that God can use anyone who is willing, that our fears don't define us, and that God's voice is waiting to be heard in the stillness. So, what can we do today? Start by saying yes to God's calling, even if you feel ordinary or inadequate. When fear arises, choose to trust Him anyway, knowing that He is always in control. And finally, take time to slow down, be still, and listen for His gentle whisper. Elijah's story isn't just his story, it's a reflection of God's work in all of us. And the same God who walked with Elijah, restored him, and used him for extraordinary purposes is ready to do the same for you. Will you listen for His whisper? Will you trust Him to lead you? Step into God's purpose for you. So, what is the hidden truth about Elijah that every Christian needs to discover? It's this: God doesn't just call the strong, He strengthens the called. He meets you right where you are, in your doubts, your fears, and even your failures. He walks with you through your struggles and equips you for the purpose He has set before you. Elijah's story is a powerful reminder that you don't have to be perfect or extraordinary for God to use you. You don't have to have all the answers or be free of fear. What you need is a willing heart and a trust in God's ability to work through you. His power is made perfect in your weakness, and His presence is more than enough to sustain you. Take this moment to reflect on Elijah's journey. Let it inspire you to trust God with your own story. Whether you feel ordinary, overwhelmed, or unsure, know this: God has a purpose for you. He is ready to meet you in the quiet moments, to speak to your heart, and to guide you forward. Trust Him, listen for His voice, and take the next step of faith, whatever that looks like for you. If Elijah, an ordinary man from an ordinary place, could make such an extraordinary impact, imagine what God can do through you. Step into His calling and walk boldly, knowing He is with you every step of the way. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Elijah's story. If you feel inspired, please subscribe to this channel for more encouragement, faith-filled insights, and powerful biblical lessons. Together, let's grow in boldness and faith, just like Elijah.